for the next few minutes, we're going to be talking about Thomas Morton and his version of the events that William Bradford also wrote about. Thomas Morton was very different from William Bradford. Thomas Morton came over to the Americas about the same time William Bradford did, but he came over for a very different purpose. You remember, Bradford was here to establish a colony. Bradford wanted to promote Christianity. He wanted to do the work of God. Thomas Morton came to America because it was a land of opportunity. He wanted money. He was mostly a trader. He was also a big supporter of the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, and which was very much against the Pilgrim and the Puritan mindset. Remember, the Pilgrims in particular were separatist, and so Morton and the Pilgrims were very much rubbed each other the wrong way over and over and over. They had very different worldviews and very different philosophies and didn't see the same things. Morton also had a lot of trouble later on with the Puritans, with the group from John Winthrop's group that comes along a little later. Morton, if you read in the biographical information, it tells you that Morton got captured and sent back to England several times and stood trial in England, and they would let him go and he would come back over here. Eventually, he came back over here and he was captured and held in jail for a long period of time, and then he escaped out into the wilderness. Eventually, some people thought he went insane and he died out in the wilderness. But Thomas Morton had his rivalries with both the separatist Pilgrims and with the Puritans, who were of Massachusetts Bay, that we'll talk about a little bit later. He wrote this book called The New English Canaan, and the title of the book sets him up as making fun of the Pilgrims and the Puritans. Remember, the Pilgrims, William Bradford thinks himself to be the Moses leading his people to the Promised Land. Well, the Promised Land for Israelites was also called Canaan. And so when he writes The New English Canaan, he's sort of tongue-in-cheek making fun of them, saying, they think they're just like the Old Testament Israelites, they think they're going to their new Canaan. And so he's making fun of them. This work was written as a part promotional tract. He wants a lot of other settlers to come along and join him in this trading and making a lot of money. It was part satire against the Pilgrims and the Massachusetts Bay Puritans. So these are the reasons for his writings. William Bradford wrote because he wanted to promote the ideals of his religious beliefs, and he wanted to encourage more people to come to America for religious purposes. Morton wanted them to come to make money. But this piece shows the conflict between the people, two groups of people, those whose motivation was economic and those whose motivation was religious. Morton tends to be very sympathetic to the Indians and very mocking of his Protestant rivals. This book also shows a big evidence of his classic education. Remember that William Bradford was pretty much self-educated, and his writing was very plain and simple. He doesn't make a lot of allusions to anything other than the Bible. The Bible is the only thing that he ever alludes to. Morton makes a lot of different allusions. Morton's most famous for erecting the Maypole of Marymount, which escalated this big disagreement between the two groups and caused a lot of problems. Now, the New English Canaan, remember I told you about the spelling differences and people spelled things in different ways. This is also a part he's also making fun. If you see the footnote on page 68, it says that Morton's name puns on the Latin for sea and on the English Mary, a taunting reference to the solemnity of the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were known to be a bit more solemn. Thomas Morton was a party-hardy kind of guy. I can see him and his buddies fitting in very well in, a college frat house. They like to drink and have good parties and have women whenever they could find them, or try to get them, or have parties to get them. So this is the different ways that these two groups thought. In this book, New English Canaan, Morton refers to himself in the third person as mine host. And that is a way to sort of give it, it gives it an appearance of more objectivity, as if he's writing this in the third person, as if he's somehow removed from this and he's not writing it in the first person. It appears to be more objective. So if you get confused in there, anytime he refers to mine host, he's referring to himself, Thomas Morton. There's a lot of allusions. An allusion is anytime you make a reference to something from history or literature. The most frequently alluded to things are the King James Bible, Shakespeare, and probably Greek mythology. But Morton makes a lot of these allusions. He talks about Ganymedes on page 68. He talks about the Trojan horse on page 70. He makes a reference to the geese at the Roman capital. The geese supposedly hissed a warning when the Gauls were attacking Rome. He makes many other of these allusions to a classical education. He also, throughout this piece, insults the Puritans many, many times. If you remember from the previous reading, William Bradford wrote about the events that I've asked you to read about from Thomas Morton. And Bradford tells you that they sent Captain Miles Standish out to try to capture Thomas Morton. Thomas Morton doesn't like Miles Standish. And Miles Standish, if you recall from history, was a very short man, only standing a little over 5 feet tall. And so throughout this, Morton refers to Miles Standish as Captain Shrimp and insulting him. They also puts another insult to them. If you look at the top of page 71, he says, well, their grand leader, at this point, Standish is supposedly mad at Thomas Morton. And so Morton says, well, Captain Shrimp took on most furiously and tore his clothes for anger to see the empty nest and their bird gone. The rest were eager to have torn their hair from their heads, but it was so short it wouldn't give them any hold. He said they wanted to tear their hair out, but they kept their hair short. You see, the Puritans and the Pilgrims kept their hair cut much shorter than was standard for most people living at the time, and so he's making fun of them with their short hairstyles, and he does these kinds of things. He refers to Miles Standish and his group of men that come to capture him as the 9 worthies, and that's another attempt to sort of make fun of them, like what are they worthy of. And it's also another one of those allusions to ancient literature. So let's look for a few moments and just sort of recount briefly the story. What happened is, Morton has encouraged these men to make a maypole, and they're having a party. You know, spring, there are lots of ancient fertility rites, and we know that in springtime a young man's thoughts turn to fancy and love, and you know, we're supposed to think about the birds and the bees and romance, and so it's that time of year when men start thinking about women. Well, if there was one thing that was missing from these new colonies, which there were actually a great many things missing, but one thing that probably these men missed most of all was European women. There weren't a lot of European women who came on these trips, and so these young men had no one to court and to romance and no one to marry, and they wanted to marry for all the reasons that they wanted to marry. So they have this big party, sort of a fertility rite, this maypole symbol, and they erect this maypole and they dance around it and they drink, and they're hoping to have wives sent over from Europe. They don't want to have to go get them. They don't want to have to get in the ship and drive over there. They want just some to appear on the little ships there. And so they're singing and they're making these songs that very much disturbed the Pilgrims. And so there's a record here of this song, and you know, the chorus, and give to the melancholy man a cup or two of now and then. This physic will soon revive his blood and make him be a merrier mood. He says, oh, let's drink some more and make us happy. And they want some lasses in beaver coats to come away. You shall be welcome to us night and day. They want some women. And if they can't find European women, they'll take native women. They don't really care. They just want women. And so Morton calls this harmless mirth made by young men that live in hope to have wives brought over to them that would save them a labor to make a voyage to fetch any over. This is what he says here about the middle of page 69. So he makes these saying that it's just a harmless thing. But William Bradford, of course, did not think it was harmless. He thought it was they were drinking too much, and they were not obeying laws, and they were causing trouble with the natives. They were giving alcohol to the natives. They were giving weapons to the natives. And so Morton says, well, that the reason that the separatists got mad at me and came after me was because they were envious of the prosperity and hope that my plantation, Marymount, had. They were envious of me, and they thought that I was some kind of great monster that they had to take down. And so these conflicts had been going on for a while, and the one that sort of brought it all to a head was this building of the Maypole. Top of page 70, Morton says that mine host was a man, remember mine host is Morton himself, that endeavored to advance the dignity of the Church of England, which they, the separatists and the Puritans, were very much against. They, on the contrary, would labor to vilify with uncivil terms. He said, we didn't agree on religion, so that was part of the problem. He claims in there that he was set up and falsely accused of things. And he says he was doing okay until the Pilgrim settlement became larger than his own settlement. And when they got to be bigger, they could cause him more trouble. He says, it appears that they were like bears' whelps in former time, when mine host plantation was of much strength as theirs, but now they're being stronger. They're like overgrown bears. They seem monstrous. He said, so they are after me now. And he tells he gets captured, and then he tells of this escape. He says nobody was looking, and I just walked out. And of course, then he talks about Captain Shrimp tearing his head, and then he talks about the 9 worthies coming toward the bottom of page 71. The 9 worthies coming before the den of the supposed monster, the 7-headed Hydra. He talks about the pilgrims being like Don Quixote, just tilting at windmills, just going around waving their swords and not doing anything productive. They, beg him to lay down his arms. And then at the top of page 72, you get sort of his version of the events. Remember, William Bradford said that, when they went in to capture them, that they were so drunk that they couldn't even hold their weapons upright, and that the only person who got hurt was the guy who ran upon his own sword. Top of page 72, Morton has a different version. He never mentions being drunk or having had anything to drink. But what he says is, they came in, and mine host, or I, Thomas Morton, was content to yield upon quarter, and did capitulate with them in what manner it should be for more certainty, because I knew what Captain Shrimp was. I just gave in to them, because I knew what kind of man he was, and I didn't want us to fight and have some violence and somebody might get hurt. And so he says, I just gave in. And that's how I became a prisoner of Captain Shrimp and these 9 worthies, was because, we just gave in to be nice to them. And you can see that his version, as you read through this, you see his version of the story is very different. His writing style is very different. His way of thinking about life is very different. Some students ask me, which one of them is telling the truth? Is Bradford telling the truth, or is Morton telling the truth? And my standard answer is usually the truth is somewhere in the middle, as in most situations. It's somewhere in the middle. Some of what Bradford said is I'm sure true, and some of what Morton said is true, at least from his perspective. And then maybe he just told this story to make it, each of them tells the story, maybe each of them tells the story to make their side look better. But it's interesting to see that even from the beginnings of this country, conflict has always been a part of what we do, or what we are, and how we developed as a nation. And you can see little bits of both of these men's ideas still flourishing in this country today. So I hope you read about John Winthrop. He's the next writer we're going to look at.